Welcome back. So here we have our final unit, as it were, which is not so much about crusades themselves as the memory of crusading, how it's been used in history. Last unit we saw the final crusades such as they were, and we saw as part of that the devolution of crusading, how it became unpopular to the point where even papal attempts to launch crusades in the wake of 1453, in the subsequent century or so, fell on deaf ears. And yet, crusading was not forgotten. Crusading came to be remembered, and in different lights over time. It's very fascinating to see the evolution and the multiple and sometimes competing deployments of crusading in historical memory. So, breaking this down at the broadest possible level, and of course you'll get to see much more of this in your readings and in the primary sources you get, we could look at, broadly the European reception versus the Islamic reception in the Middle East, and divide this up also chronologically. In Europe, right, in the wake of the Middle Ages, the period of the Renaissance, and ultimately later, it's kind of intellectual inheritor to some extent, the European Enlightenment, crusading is predictably not looked upon favorably. Renaissance artists in Italy, they looked back on a kind of fetishized, romanticized version of the Roman Empire, and they saw it as this wonderful, enlightened time, and their humanist ethic saw everything that fell between ancient Rome and their own day as sort of barbaric, dark, the Dark Ages, if you will, or the Middle Ages. Ever thought about the term middle and where it comes from? It means there has to be something on either end, right? So you have the Roman Empire, the days of the current Renaissance artists, and everything in between given over to sort of an unthinking, uncritical acceptance of papal thought and of, sort of bastardized church, which is not to say, of course, that the Renaissance artists were not Christian, of course they were, or that they were even necessarily reformers. Many of them fought ardently against Luther, who, after all, did not exactly reflect humanist ideals in every respect. However, they were disinclined to look on the Crusades favorably. The Enlightenment, even more so. The whole idea of Enlightenment is, there's many of them, but at its most basic level, a turn to rationalism and empiricism against this kind of what they would term blind, superstitious stuff. In particular, the cult of the saints falls into a very bad light for Enlightenment thinkers. And the Crusades are just one more example of how unthinking religious fanaticism leads to massacres and pointless wars and all of that. So very negative reception of the Crusades at first in the European world. In the Middle Eastern world during this time, there's actually a certain degree of, not exactly forgetfulness, but no real interest, no real focus on the Crusades in Islamic histories that are produced in the early modern period. It just falls by the wayside as not that significant. But then we enter the 19th century and, the sort of literary genre of Romanticism, where suddenly chivalry and Arthurian legends and all of this becomes very popular. The Crusades now, rather than were emblematic of barbarism and superstition, become the perfect setting for stories of chivalry, of crusaders fighting for a cause greater than themselves and, sacrificing it all. Gone is any kind of cynical reading of the Crusaders and their objectives, any kind of disillusionment with the futility of crusades. Instead, simply, they are the ideal of the noble Christian warrior. And that reception has, to one extent or another, come all the way down into the contemporary period in our usage of the word crusade. If someone's a crusader or crusading for a cause, we tend to use that phrase not to mean they're out to massacre 70,000 civilians in a city, but rather that they're fighting for a noble cause, or a cause at all, which is sort of the Romantic inheritance. Meanwhile, in this period, we also have the maximum extent reached for European colonialism and imperialism, which of course extends into the Middle East in significant ways. And you get European school teachers teaching children about the Crusades from this romantic European perspective, and it gives rebirth to narratives of characters like Salah ad-Din in particular, who only in the modern period comes to have in these newer Middle Eastern states formed after the European model, and by European mandate often enough, the kind of status that he had long enjoyed in his reception in Europe. So, turning our attention once again to the Middle East, we find in the creation of secular states in the Middle East a kind of hero figure in Salah ad-Din. Saddam Hussein will place pictures of himself right next to Salah ad-Din, as you'll see, on currency, trying to draw some kind of connection between the two, although it really is a stretch, of course. Similarly, President Assad in Syria, there's a giant statue right there in the capital of Salah ad-Din trampling over the Crusaders, as it were. So it's a symbol of independence from European domination that has for so long affected the Middle East and these secular states, but the religious element there is not so much focused. By contrast, with these anti-secular, anti-nationalist in many ways, or at least supranationalist movements, the Islamist movements, crusading has always given an important source of imagery since their inception in the 20th century. Modern examples like Al-Qaeda and even more recently ISIS draw heavily on crusade imagery, mostly as a way to demonize the West, right? To show how Western soldiers in the Middle East has a long and not very positive history. And, in some of the very first propaganda messages coming out of ISIS, the first beheadings and whatnot, the phrases they say are things like, "Here we have the first of the Crusaders," and we look forward to more Crusaders landing with all of the apocalyptic imagery that entails. So American soldiers and other European soldiers on the ground are crusaders to the Islamist movements. Unwittingly, they're assisted by the sort of ignorance we find in the West, by that sort of use of the crusade imagery to mean fighting for a cause. In fact, President Bush, right, in the Iraq War, not only speaks of how he, at various points speaks of how he's, motivated to do this partially, by inspiration from God, but also refers to the Iraq War as a crusade, which is going to be interpreted very differently in the Middle East than in the US, as it were. So, still the Crusades feature heavily in our imagination and with different results. I think you can agree with me that even though it's hardly going to solve all the issues of the modern day, certainly a more historicized understanding of the Crusades could be beneficial for people, at the very least in encouraging caution in the deployment of the term, but tying it in once again to the sort of white nationalist movements we find throughout the world, but also especially in the US. The Crusader imagery has proven a powerful and very controversial source of imagery. So you can nuance that now. You can hopefully correct people when you hear it used in specific ways, but do what you can. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to your responses to this week's readings. I think, it's one of those rare cases where it's hard to resist the notion that the Middle Ages are relevant to modern discourse. And I think it should be pretty interesting. I also look forward to reading your final assignments as those start to come in. All right, see you around.